Welcome to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican community and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda, and my husband,
Jeff Drozda, and our special guest today,
Angelica Drozda.
All right.
We have our
I'm their daughter.
Yes, one of our daughters with us, and it's very exciting because today's topic is memory and why it is so important as a Christian, as a Catholic, to have a good memory. And actually, what we're going to be talking about today is how does our faith, especially the Dominican spirituality, come into memory? So, what is memory? So, we understand, if you want to look at a basic definition of memory or to remember something, is to make something from the past present to us here and now. So why is that important? I think we have one of the greatest saints that says a lot about memory, and that's St. Thomas Aquinas. Cheryl?
In the Summa, he discusses, under the virtue of prudence, the importance of memory. So under question 49, he discusses the integral parts of prudence, and he states that now experience is the result of many memories as stated, and therefore prudence requires the memory of many things. Hence, memory is fittingly accounted a part of prudence. So within the Summa, he then begins to discuss the technique for memorizing things that we're going to be discussing later. We'll introduce that in a bit. It's a technique that I learned years ago, about 15 years ago, and I've tried to teach to all of our children. Angelica seems to be a master of the technique, so that's why she's in the studio with us today.
So in the Bible, there are many references to memory, remember, and just because I thought it was interesting, the word remember appears in the Bible 178 times in the Old Testament and 75 times in the New Testament. What is interesting is that in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, it appears 8 times, and then in Deuteronomy, it appears 16 times, and in the Psalms, 70 times. No, 40 times. So you have 40 and then 60 in the Old Testament. And what is interesting is that God continues to tell his people, you have to remember certain things. That's why it appears more times in the Old Testament than it does in the New Testament. And God continued to ask his people, actually he told them, he said, you must remember this, do this, remember this. And unfortunately, a lot of the Israelites didn't do that very often. And so that's why we look at ourselves and say, okay, what do we need to do to improve our memory?
Well, if we don't remember things, we can't be grateful for them, right? I think, yeah. Angelica, you heard a homily recently, right?
Yeah, I heard a homily by Father Pelsier, and he was talking about, like, purifying your mind and, like, your thoughts and your memory included. And he mentioned how the Israelites, like in the desert, they kept on forgetting about God, and obviously that was bad.
Right. Because when you forget about God, you're not grateful, and you obviously can fall into other idolatries and so forth. God is constantly asking his people to remember him, and recently, Father Guillory did a homily on how Jesus said, and some of his last words at the Last Supper, do this in memory of me. Of course, that elevates our memory to an even higher level. But what we want to know is, how can we use our memory best to serve us in our faith life?
So, there are there's different methods of using our memory. And, naturally, we can think of how far back do we actually remember when we were young, or, when we were happy, very happy, we have these memories. When we were very sad, we have these memories as well. There are certain triggers that we have that will trigger our memory for either good or bad. But in using our memory for the good things, for us to memorize or to remember our spiritual aspects of our faith, we can use this too. So Cheryl, how can we use any sort of certain different memory methods, and what would we use them for?
First, you can always do the old-fashioned repetition. I believe that we're all familiar with that, and if you are praying over something that really is striking you, that is a grace to go ahead and memorize that, because you can use that to help enhance your spiritual life. Also, we did as a family for 10 years the morning prayer, and I think the children all learned, right, Angelica, the Canticle of Zechariah. So we just did that by repetition. And so there are some things that you do by repetition. I know when I've gone to adoration, I found a Bible verse that really stood out, and after praying over it, every time I would go back, I started to memorize it. I mean, this is just natural repetition. But sometimes we want to memorize something, we don't have time to repeat it.
Yeah, because it's like that method takes the most time. One of my things I took up for this past Lent was Franciscan prayer, and I use the memory house for everything, the technique that my mom mentioned earlier. And but I didn't use it for this prayer because I wanted to like just repeat it every night before I went to bed. And I think that I'm still like, working on the words and what goes next. I still like check my paper to make sure I did it right. I'm like, oh, okay, that's good. And
so you alluded to the memory house. We call it the memory house. It's known as the method loci. It's an ancient form of prayer. Simonides is the Greek that's, I guess, acclaimed as the person who promoted it most. Cicero used it. So there's some great thinkers here that used it. And let's move forward a little bit. I mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, St. Albert the Great, also used this memory technique and discussed it. If you read that section of the Summa and Secunde question 49, you'll see how he actually spells out how to do it by walking yourself through different locations and creating in these locations images that he calls wanton images, something strange, something will really, the more strange, the better, right? So we've talked about that, how it can get a little crazy sometimes in our memory house, but it really helps you to, if you decide you really want to hold on to something. For example, we were talking about prayers that you really liked, Angelica, that you wanted to get to know, but when you repeat them, I had a prayer, it's called the Little Crown. I really wanted to pray it before Mass. I would have to take the paper, unfold it, take it out, pray it, and it was getting cumbersome, but I would keep doing it, but it was too long for me to memorize the whole thing, even by repetition. So finally I said, okay, I'm going to do the work and put this imagery in the memory house, and now I don't have to pull out the paper. It just is convenient. It makes it easier to pull that out when you want it and when you need those prayers.
Yeah, you can put basically like anything in the memory house. I use it all the time for school, for quizzes that like are coming up the next day, because I've gotten to the point where I can come up with an image that can correlate with what I need to memorize, and I can put it in the table really quickly. So it takes me about like, I guess 5 to 10 minutes to like make the house or the steps, the images to go through. And then after that, I have to only walk through that about like, I don't know, 2 or 3 more times before it's like really just in my memory. And my friends will be like, oh, Angelica, you have like such a just good memory. I'm like, no, I really don't. I have awful memory actually. And, but it's like with this technique, I use it for like drama, for my plays, for my lines.
Shakespeare,
yeah.
Not just any lines, Shakespeare.
Yeah, I'm usually, not to brag or anything, I'm usually one of the first ones to get my lines down, because I think it's because of this.
And also, you can also get, if it's a mom or dad or a grandparent out there, get your child or grandchild actually in trouble at school for knowing something too well. Cheryl, do you want to tell a little bit about the story real quick?
Well, another daughter, Marie, our daughter Marie, she was getting into some trouble because the teacher didn't believe how perfectly she was doing her quizzes. And I actually got an email and I said, well, we taught her the method loci, which is how she's doing this. So he began to understand how she was able to perfect that in such a short period of time. So what we are referring to can be better understood and mastered in the book Memorize the Faith and Most Anything Else by Dr. Kevin Vost. This is the book I read about 15 years ago, and it really just helped with so many things. I didn't realize how powerful it was until using it for a few years, and I determined I was going to give that powerful tool to all of our children before they left the house so that they could use that for every discipline of life, but especially it's memorizing the faith is, of course, the most important.
That's right. And even though Kevin Vost is not a sponsor, Stein Lumber is, brought to you, bringing you this great program on Christ Our King Catholic Radio, 90.5 FM, 99.5 FM, and 1230 AM. This is your local lay Dominican chapter, St. Albert the Great, based here in Lafayette, Louisiana, out of Our Lady of Wisdom Catholic Church. And today we are talking about memory and why memory is so important. I remember a homily by one of the priests here in the diocese, and he kind of stunned us by saying having a bad memory can be sinful. And that just kind of took us aback. It's like having a bad memory can be sinful. Why is that? Well, it's because if you have a lack of gratitude and you forget to be thankful and grateful for all that you have, it could lead to sin. And it just kind of, it really stuck with me that, we always say, oh, those Israelites, they didn't, the stiff-necked people, they weren't listening to God, they weren't grateful. But then all of a sudden I begin to think about my life and boy, I'm in a lot of ways just like them. I'm not grateful for every single thing that God has given us. And we need to be mindful of the grateful things that we have. And to do this and more in our spiritual life, we can use this memory technique.
So, of course, memory isn't the only part of our faith. And as Dr. Kevin Vost mentions in his introduction, to live a life of faith surely requires more than memory or even deep knowledge of doctrines and facts. It requires prayer and charity and a relationship with God. But in an important sense, memory and knowledge of the facts of our religion are necessary precursors to living a complete life of faith. We must also understand these Christian principles if we are to apply and to live them. But it's hard to think about and apply things you can't remember. So the three of us, Angelica and Jeff and I, are all doing the catechism in a year. And one of the paragraphs, believe it's 22 in the prologue, actually exhorts us to memorize some of the in brief sections so that we can commit some of the key information into our memory so that when we take something into our memory, remember how we say take it, memorize by heart? We're really putting that into our heart too, don't you think? It's not just an intellectual thing. I'll give one quick example. We used to go to the Latin Mass all the time, and I loved how they read the beginning of Gospel St. John. And when we stopped going to the Latin Mass, I really missed that part. So I wanted to memorize it so I could pray that at the end of every Mass, just like they do at the end of every Latin Mass. So I put that into memory, and if you all recognize, in the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was with God. It's such a crucial and critical part of the theology of our faith that it is prayed at the end of every Latin Mass. So having memorized that and continued to pray it after all Masses that I go to, I remember leaving the beautiful, beautiful church, St. Pius the 10th here in Lafayette, and I turned around to genuflect, and I just looked at I love the statues of the evangelists up there, and the glory of God just shines.
Those are cool,
forth.
yeah.
It is so...
It reminds me of Rome, really.
And that power, you just almost are overcome with it. And I looked up and I said, Et vidimus gloriam eius, gloriam quasi unigeniti a patre, plenum gratiae et veritatis. And it just came from my heart. That was the end of that gospel. But and I saw the glory, the beauty and the truth. And that that saying in Latin came to my heart as I looked up at the splendor and grandeur of the tabernacle in gold and all the beauty of the church in front of me. And that's how memorizing your faith, that's just one example of how it can help you to express your spirituality and help you.
Speaking of like memory being part of like your heart or coming from the heart, it's this technique that we're talking about today is it's really helpful when you're beginning to memorize things. Once you've put it in there and you've gone through it multiple times, I know that I like it. I don't even need to walk through the house anymore. It comes from the heart, like you said.
That's a good point. There are other memory techniques. This one is like training wheels that come off. You don't need them anymore. Unlike other mnemonics that you might be familiar with, let's go with the alphabet song. Singing is a great way to memorize something, but if you want to recall something quickly, like what letter comes after L, you don't have to sing the whole song again. So we all have to sing it because we use that technique. The worst thing, the one that I stumble most with, is when I go to play the piano and I have to remember every good boy does fine, great big dogs fly dog, always try to remember which lines it go to. These mnemonic devices don't seem to be as effective as this. So if you look at mnemonic devices and you think, oh, that doesn't work for me, this one will. The method low key is tried and true, like tried for 2,000 years.
Okay, so who wants to give an example? Just real briefly, an example of what we're talking about, and then people can get an understanding and a little taste about what can be accomplished.
I feel like Mom has better examples because I keep on using mine like over and over again for school and stuff.
Why don't you tell them just a few things that you used it for? Like, you don't have to give examples of what you did, but recently.
Well, okay, so for dates, actually, it's really helpful because I'm able to like remember a picture with a number in the house in like in order, you know? So
So she's talking about dates like in history.
Oh yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, I thought that was like
not the number of dates, right?
Right. But like, all right, this is gonna sound really stupid, but I had to remember 1796. It was like part of the French Revolution. And like because we recently had a quiz or like a test on that at school in my modern world class, and I'm 17 years old, so I picture myself, and then 96, or it was 98. Sorry. All right, that sounds like it's a faulty method, but no, it's not. It's like 98. I know it's 1798. So it's like I picture myself eating a cat. But wait, let me explain. It's like I picture 98 because 9 cats have 9 lives. I always remember that, and 8 is just like eating.
Okay.
So all right, it sounds funny, but like it's those crazy ones.
That's exactly what St. Thomas said. The more wanton, the more strange, as well as Dr. Vost in his book says that. One thing that I walk people through when I've done classes for high school students to try to use this. And what I want them to use it for, I also taught them logic, and to move higher in your thinking, you have to quickly memorize terminologies that you can stumble over if you're working so hard to memorize those. So I want to give them the ability to memorize those basic terminologies so that we can move into higher thinking. And that's the same thing for all of memory. It frees you up to use the memory of basic things to step higher and to think of higher things. But a lot of times I would give them the example of the 12 tribes of Israel. That would be when, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the idea is you walk up to the house and you have a big sandwich, a Reuben. For those of you who know what a Reuben is, they're carrying a Reuben. That's the first one. And then the door is just barely open and you have to shimmy in, and that's Simeon. If you're getting the idea there.
Can you go over the books of the Bible? Because I feel like those are, I really like that. And like when she was talking to me about it earlier, I actually want to like rememorize them because I did at one point, but I just stopped using it. So can you go over those, like the first few?
Yeah. So when you're coming up to the house, Genesis, a lot of times that is just an obvious one because it's the beginning of like we're walking up to the house. For me, that's all I would need. Some people might put...
I picture a girl named Jen because like I know someone who's named Jen, so it's like
exactly
it's easier for me.
It makes it easy when you have a quick association with something. So the first thing you think of when you think of these words, Genesis. So then there's on the door, it says actually exit, even though you're about ready to enter. So Exodus is where you're actually going to enter. You go into the house, you look off to your left through the window, and you see out the window, a pair of Levi jeans. So we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, right? And then you look to the right, you swing over to the right of the door, and hanging on the other side of the door is a picture that has a bunch of mathematical facts on it.
It's numbers.
It's just numbers, right? So now we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers.
Deuteronomy.
And Deuteronomy is next, which is in the book, it'll show you a gun rack there. What we put there is a telescope. So you do astronomy, and that's Deuteronomy. Yeah. That unlocks Deuteronomy, right? So, and then in the middle of the room is someone I know named Joshua, who's married to my cousin Molly. So he's standing in the middle of the room, and then above him in the chandelier are a bunch of judges looking over with their gavels, looking out over the chandelier. So that's judges. So you're getting the idea that these images come up in a certain location. And that's why we can remember them. We know where in our mind's eye to look next. And so we can unlock the next section of our memory.
Also, you don't always need to use a person. For example, my mom was saying that the next step is looking into a mirror, and she pictures her grandmother Ruth, but I'm or you could picture Babe Ruth, because for all those who don't have a grandma named Ruth, right. That's helpful.
And this shows you the different ways that people will come about these images. But the great thing about Dr. Kevin Vost's book is he walks you through how to do it, and then he slowly lets you do it on your own, so that you get to the point where by the time you get to the books of the Bible, he's letting you come up with the images on your own. He's already kind of trained you how to do it. And then when you leave this book behind, it's amazing that as you practice it, which Angelica has practiced it a lot, you can become very proficient at it. You use it for Latin sometimes?
Yeah, I've used it for so many things, and sometimes I just need to remember somebody's name, and I'm okay, I need to put this in the memory house real quick, and I can do that, and then remember it that night, after school. I think it's really helpful because I've just gotten to a point where I can do it so fast, and I think it's good for creativity. I think that it really just helps you stretch your mind and seeing what you're capable of, because some of the things I put in the memory house is that's a stretch, but it's I think it helps you unlock some creativity and just kind of artistic, your artistic way, which you some of the scientific stuff about that. I don't really.
As far as the left brain, right brain, is that what you're talking about? So the left brain takes up information quickly and analyzes, and the right brain is for more artsy, emotional stuff. It's also where we have our long-term memory. So when we take up something and learn it, it can go right back out if we don't move it into the right side of our brain. And so what this book is, what this method loci is doing is helping you to pull instantly the stuff from the left side of the brain that you're uptaking, moves it into some sort of emotional or humorous. That's why the humorous pictures work. Humor is on that side of the brain. So when you pull it into there, into some imagery and artistic form, you instantly lock that into your long-term memory. And that's why this is so very, very effective.
You're listening to Christ Our King Catholic Radio here in Acadiana, 90.5 FM, 99.5 FM, and 1230 AM. This is your lay Dominican group, and this is the radio program Studium to Studio. We're talking about memory. And Cheryl, you had mentioned once before about the year of St. Joseph and why that was a very important time, and how memory really came into your life. Yeah.
So I'm a convert, and when with a lot of people who are former Protestants, it's a little bit difficult to understand asking for intercession. It takes a little time when you haven't been raised with that. So the year of St. Joseph came about, and everybody was excited. They were doing the litany of St. Joseph, and I have to admit that I wasn't as excited. I didn't have that connection, or I didn't think I had that connection with St. Joseph. But I took time one day, and I was really thinking, and I was talking to a friend about building things, and I had a memory. The memory was when our oldest daughter, Beth, was little girl, and I wanted to build a little puppet house for her. It turns out to be a big puppet house. And I thought, I had this in my mind of what I wanted to do, and I had a little bit of time to do it in the equipment because I was at my stepfather's house. And so I thought, I'm going to use this equipment. I'm going to build a little puppet house castle. And at one end, I'll put a bookshelf, and at the other end will be this puppet house of her in her room. And so I actually prayed. I'm like, okay, this is where I need to ask for intercession because I really don't know what I'm doing. So I asked St. Joseph, I mean, he's a carpenter, right? So I said, dear St. Joseph, help me if you can. And if I can make this into something that would glorify the Blessed Mother, that would be extra special. So it turns out, the castle turned out beyond my abilities because, look, I'm not a carpenter. I've never done anything like this. But it was a beautiful puppet house that had turrets on the top on one side, and on the other side was a bookshelf with a grotto cut into it with the statue of the Blessed Mother. And lo and behold, within a couple of years of building that, my devotion to the Blessed Mother had grown so much, which also helped my entire spiritual life growing closer to our Lord, of course, because the Blessed Mother brings us closer. But it all began with that little prayer of intercession, asking St. Joseph to help me with that carpentry. And when I remembered that, I was so grateful, and I felt a connection to him. And that year became so much more special when that happened.
And, it's also important that, there are times when we have darkness in our life. And it's these times that sometimes we have to recall maybe some good memories, maybe some prayers that will shine some light onto that darkness. And you had some thoughts on that.
Well, final thought would be to encourage everyone, when you're praying, when you're reading the Bible, anything that hits you spiritually, a song, whatever, a psalm, a prayer. Right now, Psalm 119 is something that I'm trying to just do Lectio Divina and also memorize part of. And I would just strongly recommend that that's a grace from the Holy Spirit. Hold on to that. Do your part and memorize some of it, because that can become a light in the darkness. Just like a prayer book a priest had given me had a beautiful prayer to the Holy Spirit, and I memorized it because it really drew my attention. And during a dark period in my life, I held on to that prayer, and it's really what got me through. So I just want to encourage everybody to do the same. Any other thoughts?
Well, something else to help you just remember, God's goodness. At the end of the day, what really helps me is, I guess, an examination of the day.
Yes.
And I remember, 5 things that I'm grateful for and I can thank God for, in my prayer.
Perfect.
And that really helps.
Well, thank you for being with us. We've enjoyed our time, and God bless.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death, and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body...